ABC received more than one complaint on a single item on Dark Shadows in 1968. The vampire wasn't the one. The blood was not the cause. At 3:30 p.m., the network permitted it to air, as soon as children arrived home from school. The show was ABC's largest daytime hit by 1970, with 9 million viewers per day. Then, in just 8 months, everything fell apart. The network attempted to point the finger to the ratings, but the true cause was a violent film that caused parents to leave theaters and forbid their kids from ever watching the program again. In 1965, it all began with an odd dream. After witnessing something he couldn't get rid of, Dan Curtis woke up in the middle of the night. A young woman was seen getting off a train at an empty platform in that dream. She appeared disoriented, as though she had just arrived at the end of the line. Mist was present. Silence fell. She was on her way to work as a governess at a large, desolate home perched on a hill. Curtis told his wife, Norma May, exactly what he saw as soon as he woke up. Then he took a nearly ineffective action. The following morning, he presented that dream to ABC. Just that one thought from his mind, without a screenplay or a whole storyline. And miraculously, ABC agreed within a day. That vision became a television program that ran for 5 years and 25 episodes. ABC didn't know what they were getting themselves into. In order to compete with industry titans like CBS's As the World Turns, which at the time had 13.9 ratings, they believed it to be just another family soap opera. ABC was in dire need. They were looking for anything new because their daytime numbers were plummeting. Thus, they approved Dan Curtis, without realizing it would become something very different. They didn't request comprehensive scripts. Not even appropriate characters were requested. Curtis's confidence in that dream were all they had. Curtis enlisted the help of seasoned writer Art Wallace, who was familiar with Gothic fiction, to make that ambition a reality. Shadows on the Wall is a whole-tale Bible that Wallace constructed. It had everything. The first 40 episodes' plot outlines, the characters, and the setting. Early on, Wallace had intended to kill Roger Collins, but when circumstances changed, that plan was abandoned. Later, collectors were shelling out hundreds of dollars to acquire a copy of that original tale Bible, since it had become so uncommon. Together, Wallace and Curtis wrote the first 8 weeks of the show, which established the tone for the rest of it. The program was intended to be ABC's covert tool. CBS was a big hit. There were powerful soap operas on NBC. Almost little on ABC operated throughout the day. To seal the deal, Curtis promised them a Gothic romance. However, he was more interested in anything sinister, with supernatural undertones. He bided his time to make it public. The show was initially a failure. It ranked 13th out of 18 shows with a rating of 4.1 when it debuted in June 1966. It fell to dead last in a few months. 2 days after its premiere, Variety gave it a dull review. The leisurely pace was despised. Critics claimed that Alexandra Mulkey's portrayal of the lead character, Victoria Winters, lacked emotion, and they unable to relate to her. ABC was quickly growing impatient. They issued an ultimatum to Curtis by December 1966. The show would be canceled if he didn't improve the ratings in 26 weeks. That pressure turned out to be the pivotal moment. Curtis made the decision to fulfill his lifelong dream. He introduced a vampire. Everything changed with episode 210. In April 1967, it was broadcast. Willie Loomis opened a chained casket after breaking into the Collins mausoleum. It contained Canadian actor Jonathan Fryde's vampire character, Barnabas Collins. Even though the vampire was only expected to be there for 13 weeks, the ratings shot up right away. The show's ratings almost doubled to 7.3 by the next year. After school, teenagers hurried home to watch Barnabas. Dark Shadows was suddenly more than a soap opera. The hit was supernatural. Barnabas became the protagonist, and Fred remained there permanently. That wasn't the end of Curtis. He started putting together a group that would fundamentally alter the appearance and atmosphere of daytime television. He employed Henry Kaplan, John Sedgwick, and Layla Swift as directors. These folks were accustomed to storytelling in a theatrical setting. He hired Robert Cobert to compose the music, and the result was one of the most recognizable television themes ever. In 1969, one song, Quentin's Theme, even made it into the top 10 and received a Grammy nomination. The soundtrack CD itself became one of the most popular TV soundtrack albums ever, reaching the top 20. Using Victorian furniture and deep shadows, set designer Cy Thomas created a gloomy Gothic ambiance within the studio. As creator and executive producer, Curtis assumed complete control of the project, with Robert Costello serving as line producer. Together, they created a show that aired in the afternoon, but had the appearance and sound of prime time. Casting was also very important. Born in 1910, Joan Bennett had already acted in more than 70 movies, including 1940s blockbusters. As the matriarch Elizabeth Collins Stoddard, who hadn't left her mansion in 18 years, she joined in 1966, at the age of 56. The 6 a.m. wasn't fun for her, call times or consuming food from paper cups in between scenes, but she provided credibility to the program. She stayed for 386 episodes and received an Emmy nomination for her performance in 1968. Then there was Alexandra Mulkey, who had minimal experience and was only 21 at the time. Based on The Woman in His Dream, Dan Curtis cast her as Victoria Winters. Her performance was criticized for being wooden. She was bound by a 5-year contract and earned roughly $350 per week. She grew weary of always being abducted or imprisoned in rooms, while the otherworldly stuff took center stage. She requested a more difficult job, such as playing a vampire, after becoming pregnant in 1968, but the producers turned her down, and she resigned after 210 episodes. Roger Collins was portrayed by Louis Edmonds. Born in 1923, he has extensive Broadway stage experience. He had resided in New York with 2 long-term lovers, and was outspokenly gay. He contributed a theatrical intensity to Dark Shadows that gave his scenes a grandiose, perhaps inadvertently humorous atmosphere. Throughout the 12-24 episodes, he demonstrated his variety by playing Roger and then several relatives, including Joshua, Edward, and Daniel Collins. When David Hennessy played David Collins, he was only 9 years old. He was born in 1956 and produced eerie performances, particularly when his character acted possessed or spoke to ghosts. When the ghost of Jameson Collins took control of him, in episodes 700-800, it was one of his greatest moments. He portrayed both roles. He had exceptional talent for a child actor over the 200 FN episodes. Just as much thought went into choosing the supporting actors. Nancy Barrett was the only actor to play Carolyn Stoddard for the full 5-year run, appearing in 403 episodes. After 107 episodes, Mitchell Ryan, who had been cast as Burke Devellin, was sacked due to his drunkenness in 1967. Anthony George took his position. Prior to the start of the show, Barrett wed her agent Ralph Pine. She eventually got divorced and married co-star David Ford in 1967. Only 2 years were spent in that marriage. Dark Shadows was in rapid decline when it debuted. It fell to 13th place out of 13 soap operas that were still in production by the end of 1966. 6 others had previously been canceled by ABC. They now offered Dan Curtis a final opportunity. He just had 26 weeks to fix it, or else it would be lost as well. He gambled recklessly. A vampire by the name of Barnabas Collins made his on-screen debut in episode 211 on April 18, 1967. Then everything was different. In a single year, viewership increased from 4.3 rating points to 7.3. This indicated that more than 3 million additional households were observing. It was reaching 7 to 9 million people every day by the end of 1969. The nearly canceled program turned to become ABC's biggest daytime hit. It even reached a 28.8 share in 1968. The network was incredulous. The vampire transformed a dying show into a goldmine in under a year. Jonathan Frid was at the heart of it. He received about 300 letters a week when he first appeared as Barnabas. It was the summer of 1967. However, he was receiving 6,000 letters each week by December 1968. It wasn't a typo. Large sacks of mail were being delivered to the studio by postalmen specifically for him. These weren't merely fan notes either. Teenage girls asked him to bite their necks in many of them. How this occurred was unknown to him. He was a 43-year-old Canadian who had studied Shakespeare before becoming one of the most sought-after actors on television. He received about 5,000 letters a week, even when his role was confined to a coffin and not on TV. His followers worshipped him rather than merely observing him. The odd thing was that he nearly refused. Jonathan Frid was not interested in portraying a vampire. He didn't want to damage his career with a ridiculous horror role, because he had studied at Yale and done serious theater. However, time was running out for ABC. Associate producer Bob Costello made the decision, because Dan Curtis was in England at the time of the casting. For a brief 13-week storyline, Frid was hired fast, But the clock had already begun when he joined. The show would be canceled if the ratings didn't increase. He was uncertain, afraid, and on the verge of declining. However, something clicked when he eventually assumed the post. Barnabas wasn't portrayed by him as malevolent. People couldn't take their eyes off him, because he played him as a man in misery, a man stuck in his past. There wouldn't have been Barnabas without Fred, and Gloomy Shadows would have just vanished in silence if Barnabas hadn't been there. The teenagers followed. The concert was rescheduled for 3:30 p.m. in 1967, period of time. School ended at that time. Children hurried home, switched on the television, and were dragged into an unfamiliar world of ghosts, witches, and vampires. Teenagers were suddenly the target audience. The majority of the 7-9 million viewers per day by 1968 were younger than 18. On daytime TV, that had never happened before. Advertisers took notice. Other networks took note. Before long, all networks were attempting to replicate the formula. The latest vogue was romantic vampires with dejected eyes. This would be the case for everything from Twilight to The Vampire Diaries. Furthermore, Dark Shadows was not limited to television. It was made into a film in 1970. After being released in theaters, House of Dark Shadows quickly gained popularity. The show's ratings suffered for a period because parents didn't like it, despite the fact that its violence frightened viewers. Now, however, Barnabas Collins was everywhere. His image appeared on magazines, posters, Halloween costumes, and lunchboxes. Before there were ever fan conventions, fans began to meet in person and plan their own get-togethers. People were still remembering the vampire gamble that paid off 45 years later when Tim Burton and Johnny Depp made their own version in 2012. However, the show was not a hit with everyone. Preacher Jack Chick's comic book, from the late 1960s, referred to it as Satan's favorite television program. Nationwide protests were sparked by that single line. Religious organizations attempted to close it. After school, they didn't want kids to watch witches and vampires. However, the protests caused the show to explode rather than fail. By 1969, the audience had grown from 2.8 million to 18 million. The White House took notice. Tricia, the daughter of President Nixon, welcomed Jonathan Fred to the White House during Halloween while dressed as a vampire. He spent the night with 250 kids while posing as Barnabas Collins. Officially, the vampire had become popular. Behind the scenes, stories weren't always positive. One of the main characters, Burke DeVellin, was portrayed by Mitchell Ryan, who struggled with alcoholism. Yet everything broke apart in June 1967. He began to cause disruption by missing tapings and turning up intoxicated. He broke down at Dan Curtis's office one day, and that was all. After episode 248, he departed the program. In 247 episodes, he had appeared. Although Anthony George began playing the part in episode 262, the role was never accepted by the fans. The change was too abrupt. Fortunately, Ryan sobered up and went on to appear in films like Magnum Force and Lethal Weapon. Although he acknowledged years later, "I was so drunk that year, I barely remember what it was about." March 2022 was his death month. The show was equally outrageous. Since Dark Shadows was recorded live, there were no actual edits. They hardly practiced. It remained in if someone made a mistake. Boom. Mics appeared in the frame. Members of the crew walked through scenes. In the middle of a conversation, actors would forget their lines. One actor was unable to correct himself when he stated incestors instead of ancestors. During serious scenarios, swords fell from walls. The lamps were broken. Backstage, fire extinguishers went off. Because it was so frequent, they adored the errors. ABC celebrated the turmoil by releasing a blooper collection in 1993. It was unlike anything else on TV. It felt genuine and unvarnished. One of the show's stars was Grayson Hall. Although she struggled on Dark Shadows, she had received an Oscar nomination for The Night of the Iguana in 1964. She once said she didn't grasp the plot, stumbled, and lost her place. Even her husband, who was one of the writers, was powerless to assist. At one cafe, a waitress had to tell her the story. Still, she gave it her best. She took the words seriously, even when they were absurd. Her delivery was dubbed a Grayson Hall stammer by fans. And for some reason, that added to the peculiar allure of the show. Once a big Hollywood celebrity, Joan Bennett first detested her profession. She was accustomed to luxury and limousines. It was now 3:30 a.m. when she was waking up, doing scenes on a cheap set and consuming soup from vending machines at 10:30. A day on this show felt like 3 in Hollywood, she claimed. Then something occurred. She witnessed how many youngsters loved her in 1968. The teeny boppers just flooded me when I was in the Midwest narrating a fashion show a month ago, she remarked. She never saw it coming, and the mistakes remained throughout. The reason was straightforward. Editing was expensive. A 1-hour videotape reel cost $300. And if they had to make a cut, they had to buy a brand new reel, which they couldn't afford. As a result, when actors mispronounced lines or broke props, they continued. No one anticipated that a daytime soap opera would become this bizarre when Dark Shadows aired in 1966. But by the time ABC finally acquired electronic editing equipment in the early 1970s, fans had already fallen in love with the roughness. It felt alive. It felt unpredictable. And that was what made Dark Shadows so memorable. Edits were few, and when they occurred, they looked rough. In episode 210, a vampire was introduced, and then everything changed. In episode 255, a small, pale girl named Sarah Collins appeared in the old house's basement. She was a ghost, and although she had died of pneumonia, the show's world explained that her death was caused by a voodoo doll used by a witch named Angelique. In order to force Barnabas Collins to marry her, she had done this. Now this child ghost was showing up in violent scenes with blood and chains, appearing next to murder victims and vampires biting women's necks. She appeared in 109 episodes, including one where she saw Barnabas return home with blood on his collar after attacking women on the street. In episode 276, Barnabas killed someone on screen, and his hand grabbed Jason McGuire by the throat. The show abruptly cut to the opening credits, and viewers at home became confused. Parents complained to ABC, saying they couldn't understand how a child ghost could be shown at 400 p.m. next to a man draining blood from people in a basement. The entire scene, which lasted 8 minutes and included every detail down to the last shovel of dirt, showed Jason lying dead on the basement floor when it returned. Barnabas and his servant Willie picked up the body and carried it through a foggy graveyard before burying it in a secret room inside the family mausoleum. At 3:30 p.m., while kids were still eating after-school snacks, ABC received 847 complaint letters from parents who felt the show had gone too far. That same year, the vampire bite scenes began to get longer. Barnabas wasn't the evil Dracula type. Instead, he looked sad when he attacked people. When the camera zoomed in, viewers saw the bites occur in slow motion, sometimes lasting nearly a minute, with blood trickling down necks and faces appearing calm or even strange, as if they were enjoying it. He displayed guilt, and the victims didn't scream, instead appearing to be in some sort of trance. The FCC received 200 complaints about these bite scenes. Alone between 1967 and 1968, ABC attempted to restrict them to once a week, but the ratings were so high that they were permitted every day. Other networks attempted to imitate the model. At least 23 vampire-themed shows were introduced between 1968 and 1971, but none of them survived. And then the seances began. Real ones, not fake ones. Religious groups did not take it lightly, and church councils issued warnings. The cast sat in candlelit rooms, used Ouija boards, recited Latin chants, and even hired real occult experts to guide them. In episode 365, a seance was held to contact Sarah's ghost, and viewers at home were unsure if it was for fun or something darker. People boycotted local ABC stations in 37 cities. Parents in 15 states signed petitions to postpone the show. A Houston teen who studied black magic called it the only worthwhile daytime program. Practicing occultists in Chicago said it was a good representation of how real rituals operated, and churches were incensed. They claimed that the show was instilling harmful ideas in children's minds. In 1968, the story transported viewers to 1795, the year of the Salem-style witch trials. In episode 385, Victoria Winters was tied to a tree, while a Reverend Traz, shouted Latin prayers over her. The actor had committed more than 200 lines of authentic exorcism text to memory. Victoria's trial ended with her facing a noose, and parents couldn't believe it. The trial scenes used exact quotes from real 1692 court records, but the timeline was off. The real Salem trials took place 100 years earlier, but the show didn't explain the time error. Churches nationwide deemed the show dangerous, and ABC received 2,100 complaints about the Salem episodes alone. Despite the criticism, the show continued until 1970, when the brutal full-length film House of Dark Shadows debuted on August 25th, drawing in audiences from those who enjoyed the television series. They witnessed something else, though. Blood flew across the screen, twisted necks of dead people, children screaming in theaters, parents leaving midway through, stakes driven into vampires' chests, and Barnabas Collins tearing into people rather than just biting them. The shock didn't go away. They told their children they couldn't watch the show anymore when they got home. ABC received a ton of complaints. PTA groups became involved. Some affiliates stopped airing the show altogether. Parents who had previously trusted the show suddenly saw it as dangerous. The movie ruined the show's family image, and it was too late to fix it. With 7 to 9 million viewers per day, in 1969, Dark Shadows was ABC's biggest daytime hit. It had an 8.4 Nielsen rating, with a 27 share in 1968-69, but by 1970 it had fallen to a 5.3 rating, with a 16 share, meaning that nearly 4 million viewers had left, the majority of whom were children and teenagers who watched after school. The decision was already made, but behind the scenes more things were falling apart. Without them, advertisers pulled out. ABC wanted to replace the show, and they chose Password, a straightforward game show with no ghosts, no blood, and nothing to complain about. Password began airing on April 5, 1971, and Dark Shadows ended on April 2. The actor who played Barnabas, Jonathan Fred, expressed his disinterest in appearing in the second film, claiming that he was afraid of being typecast, and that he didn't want to become another Bela Lugosi, stuck playing vampires forever. The show's creator, Dan Curtis, became irate and decided to write Fred out, replacing him with a new character named Bramwell. However, everyone knew that the show wouldn't function without Barnabas, and Curtis was exhausted. Around January 15, he informed the cast that the show would be ending. ABC blamed the ratings, but this was also his decision. He had written or directed more than 1,200 episodes. He told the cast that he was done with the show, that he had nothing left, and that he wanted to make movies, not TV shows. The majority of viewers were between the ages of 12 and 18. They didn't purchase household goods, soap, or cleaning supplies. Advertisers didn't care about them. ABC needed adult women who made the purchases, and Dark Shadows couldn't provide that. Therefore, even with its peak audience of 9 million, the show wasn't profitable. In the last few months, it attempted to turn a profit. Even though the network had already moved on, the show had left a lasting impression, and its theme song, Quentin's Theme, became the only soap opera song to ever reach number 13 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1969, and was nominated for a Grammy. The show's ratings increased slightly, but not enough. More significantly, Dark Shadows altered the perception of television by introducing the concept of a vampire who did not wish to kill. Barnabas felt guilty, cried, and loved. Every subsequent vampire series was influenced by that concept. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, True Blood, and The Vampire Diaries all took inspiration from Barnabas. It demonstrated that soap operas could be bizarre, and the daily shows were able to employ ghosts, time travel, and parallel universes. Prior to Dark Shadows, nobody believed that this was possible on daytime television. But after Dark Shadows, everyone tried.